Hi, this is Margaret with Civic Nebraska's Voting Rights Team, and today we're going to be looking at the Voting Rights Amendment, and we do have a guest with us that I'll introduce to you later on. But let's go ahead and get started. And to understand why the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was necessary, we're going to go back to the end of the Civil War. In 1865, under President Andrew Johnson, Southern states passed restrictive black codes to control the labor and behavior of former slaves and other African Americans. There is a backlash to this in 1867, and Congress passes the Reconstruction Act, which imposes federal military rule over most of the South. And in addition, in 1870, Congress passes the 15th Amendment, and it states, Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2, the Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So during the 1870s, more than 500,000 black men registered to vote and become voters. Remember, this is before women were allowed to vote. In Mississippi, former slaves made up more than half of the state's population. Most of this new voting bloc solidly supported Republican candidates. In 1870, Mississippi sent 2 black U.S. senators to Washington and elected a number of black state officials, including a lieutenant governor. And Mississippi will come up frequently in this presentation. In 1877, we see the end of Reconstruction, and with federal troops no longer present to protect the rights of black citizens, many black men ceased voting due to intimidation from employers and threats of violence by the Ku Klux Klan. In 1890, Mississippi holds a convention to write a new state constitution. Convention leader Solomon Calhoun stated, "We came here to exclude the Negro." So it's pretty clear, it's pretty evident what the intention of that convention was. Because the 15th Amendment prohibited states from excluding black men from voting, the Mississippi Constitution placed barriers to prevent them from voting, and these included an annual poll tax, and you were required to have paid this tax for 2 years consecutively before you would be allowed to vote. They also enacted a literacy test, and potential voters had to read aloud from the state constitution and then were quizzed by the county clerk. And obviously, how difficult the quiz was, what the questions asked, depended on what race you were when you were registering. They also put in a grandfather clause, and through this clause, it exempted from the previous 2 barriers, the poll tax and the literacy test. It exempted anyone who had ancestors who were qualified to vote before the Civil War. So obviously, you know, that disenfranchised all black people right there. Other southern states soon did likewise. So by 1940, due to this intimidation, violence, and racial discrimination in state voting laws, only 3% of voting age black men and women in the South were registered to vote. 3%. In Mississippi, again, we're going to talk about Mississippi a lot, less than 1% were registered. By not being able to vote, African Americans had little influence in their communities. They had no say in how their taxes were utilized. They did not hold public office. They had little, if any, control over local police, courts, or public schools. By the 1950s, ensuring the voting rights of African American men and women became a central focus of the civil rights movement. In 1955 alone, in 2 separate incidents, 2 voting rights activists were killed. They were Reverend George Lee and Lamar Smith. Smith was killed in broad daylight on the lawn of the courthouse, and no one was ever convicted in his death. 1957 and 1960, Congress passes 2 civil rights acts to strengthen the Justice Department's ability to enforce existing voter laws. And one success of the acts was the creation of the Commission on Civil Rights. Then in 1961 specifically, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Council of Federated Organizations undertook a massive effort to register black voters in the South. Mississippi becomes their first target due to its low percentage of registered Black voters. Only 6.7% in 1961 in Mississippi were registered to vote. Large numbers of students from the North joined the Freedom Riders for several subsequent summers. So this is an ongoing project. In 1962, Congress passes the 24th Amendment, which eliminates poll taxes in federal elections, and it is ratified in 1964. 1965, in Dallas County, Alabama, it's selected as the next target for voter registration as less than 1% of eligible Black citizens are registered to vote. 600 people attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, and are attacked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge by police and state troopers wielding billy clubs and tear gas. Televised coverage of the event sparks global outrage. As a result of the efforts of civil rights organizers, on August 6, 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act, which banned the use of literacy tests and provided for federal oversight of the voting process in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population was not registered. It also authorized the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections. The act is amended 5 times between 1965 and 2006. Then in 2014, we have a real blow to voting rights, and that is a Supreme Court case that's decided, and it's the case of Shelby versus Holder, and they strike down many of the protections in the Voting Rights Act when it determines that local election officials can change voting laws and close polling locations without approval from the federal government. More than 1,600 polling locations have since closed, mostly in communities that are predominantly comprised of people of color. Scholars at UCLA found that voters in Black neighborhoods waited on average 29% longer to vote than voters in predominantly white communities. And then we have another significant event that just happened recently in voting rights history. On July 17th, Representative John Lewis died, and he had served the state of Georgia as their representative for the 5th District for 33 years. He was one of 600 people who marched that day from Selma to Montgomery in 1965, and over 477,933 signed the petition to rename the infamous bridge that they marched across after Lewis. So I did include a link to the petition if you're interested in signing that as well. So I did say that we did have a guest joining us today. Today we have Brad Christian-Sallis, who is the Voting Rights Field Director for Civic, Nebraska. And Brad, what does voting mean to you?
Voting to me means power, and it's kind of like you discussed earlier, that ability to determine what's happening in your community and having a role in what's happening, because we all want to have voice over our own life.
I think, yeah, especially, I mean, people get really excited a lot of times about federal elections. They get excited, you know, we see the biggest turnout for, say, the presidential election, which only happens every 4 years. And the local elections play such a strong role in what happens in our daily lives that we just really need to see people turning out for those as well as, you know, some of the bigger elections.
Definitely, we need more people getting involved in local elections and just all levels of our democracy. I think one of the big things is so many people, that's the one thing they do is they'll vote, but then they don't follow that up with other advocacy for the things they care about. And that's, you know, from local to federal, we need a lot more of that. And you mentioned Representative John Lewis, and just everything he did in his life, it was always about more than just him voting. Like once he had gotten that right to vote, he didn't stop. He kept advocating and being involved in so many different ways to push people's rights forward.
And we won't all go on to serve as, our representative in Washington, but we can all play a part. And the fact that he had 33 years on the job, to me, is just really admirable. I mean, it really was a life mission and life work to advocate for the people in his district.
Oh, definitely. I mean, like you said, 33 years um, is more than my entire life. And that was just his time in the House of Representatives, not even the work he did as a civil rights leader. So it just shows how long term the movement and movement building for voting rights will need to be, but just how invested we all need to be in it. And uh, hopefully we can all get to the point where we're ready and willing to make the same level of sacrifice that he made.
I think too, when we talk about, say, Shelby and Holder, the struggle for people's voting rights isn't something that happens and then the fight is over. That we
Hmm.
backslide, that we regress, and we have done that since they crossed that bridge in Alabama. We're cutting away some of those protections. So people need to be watchful and pay attention and be alert, because voting rights are not something to take for granted.
No, not at all. And it's such a powerful thing where people do want to take away that right from people. So it's very important that each of us do everything we can to protect not only our individual voting rights, but the voting rights of others, and making sure we're making the voting process better and easier for people, and making sure we're educating people on that process so that we're really pushing forward what John Lewis dedicated his life to, versus just kind of getting stagnant and relying that people have done in the past. And just because there's been something in the past doesn't mean that if we don't stay active and continue to advocate, that we'll always have those rights. Yeah, Shelby versus Holder was a big blow um, to voting rights, and it's something that we have to continue to work to get those rights back. But even before that case, there was a lot of work to be done with voting rights to continue to make sure people have voting rights, especially those people in our country who have felonies. They're in so many places, including here in Nebraska. Just their rights are taken away, and their voting rights particularly.
Thanks, Brad. And if you are interested in standing and protecting voting rights, as Brad and I have been discussing, we make that really easy for you to do that at Civic Nebraska. And you can do that even from the safety of your home during this uncertain era, where we are trying to socially isolate from each other. You can join by our outreach circle, which is an online platform. We have lots of actions that you can take right there from the safety of your home. You can either scan that QR code on your screen with your smartphone or visit the link at the bottom there, and you can get signed up, and we can get you started right away to help defend democracy. Thanks for joining me today, Brad.
Oh, no, thanks for having me, Margaret.
And thanks to all of you for watching.
Have a good one.